It's Timothy again, and I have a video for you that answers what happens when revenge turns deadly. From a man who spent months watching the man he believed wronged his family walk freely through the corridors he cleaned every day, to a technician who used his technical expertise to set an invisible trap.
It was September 3rd, 2017. Inside a large convention arena on the outskirts of Las Vegas, stage lights and crowd noise filled the venue, while the service corridors behind it remained controlled and quiet. In one of those hallways, security cameras recorded a routine escort that lasted seconds before a single act ended a career and a life. Earlier that afternoon, Adrian Sloan, 27, known online as Viper, finished a semi-final match before thousands of spectators. He grew up in suburban Arizona and built his career streaming first-person shooter games from a small bedroom setup. By his mid-20s, he had signed with a professional team, traveling year-round and earning income from sponsors and tournaments. His name later appeared in civil filings tied to online misconduct allegations involving minors. One complaint was dismissed, and another remained pending, and he continued competing while the cases moved through court. Professional esports tournaments operate like broadcast sporting events. Players move between the stage and media rooms through restricted service corridors, escorted by security to prevent fan contact. Ceiling-mounted cameras record continuously. The hallway measured about 8 feet wide, with concrete floors and metal service doors spaced every few yards. Working that shift was Leo Ramirez, 53, a maintenance employee assigned to custodial duties. Court records later identified him as the father of a 19-year-old woman who had filed a misconduct complaint against Sloan the previous year. Ramirez had no prior violent history and reported for his shift at 6 a.m., completing routine cleaning tasks throughout the day. Security logs show Sloan was scheduled to move from the main stage to a press room at 8:42 p.m. 2 contracted guards escorted him through Corridor C toward the media suites. Ramirez's cleaning assignment placed him near a trash bin along that path. He wore a visible staff badge and pushed a gray cart stocked with supplies. Because the corridor was considered secure, only limited staff were permitted inside during escorted movements. Cameras covered both the entrance and midpoint of the hallway, creating 2 recorded angles before and during the incident. There were no active alerts tied to Sloan's movement. At 8:43 p.m., Sloan was walking between the guards, holding a water bottle. A separate camera at the corridor entrance captured the escort seconds earlier, establishing his route. Ramirez stepped away from the trash bin and reaches into the lower compartment of his cart. He removes a gas-powered construction nailer, a tool designed to drive steel fasteners at high speed. From less than 2 feet away, he fires once. The steel fastener enters Sloan's left eye socket and penetrates the skull. One guard restrains Ramirez while the other attempts to assist Sloan. The nailer falls to the concrete floor. Sloan collapses immediately, motionless on the corridor floor. Emergency services were called immediately. On-site medical personnel arrived within minutes and began resuscitation, but Sloan showed no purposeful movement. Officers secured the corridor and detained Ramirez without resistance. Sloan was transported to a nearby trauma hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner reported penetrating cranial trauma. Investigators reported the fastener entered through the eye socket and penetrated the brain, causing catastrophic damage and rapid blood loss. The injuries were described as rapidly fatal. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Prosecutors charged Leo Ramirez with open murder with use of a deadly weapon and possession of a weapon at a public event. In 2019, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison, with parole eligibility after 10 years. Court findings described the attack as retaliatory. Event organizers later revised staff access controls and escort procedures. It was August 12, 2016. The town gymnasium in Laredo, Texas, buzzed with the final night of the Miss Rio County pageant. Folding chairs lined the polished basketball court, and a temporary runway stretched 4 feet above the floor. Stage lights washed the plywood platform in harsh white glare, masking small gaps between panels. One of the contestants was Elena Cruz, 24. She was the reigning title holder. By day, she worked as a dental assistant. By night, she coached younger contestants hoping to follow her path. She was disciplined and competitive. Months earlier, during a regional qualifier, witnesses reported seeing her backstage holding sewing scissors near Marisol Vega's gown shortly before its inner seam was discovered cleanly cut. Though removed from the dressing area, she was not disqualified due to a lack of video proof. Marisol Vega, 22, had saved nearly a year to enter that competition. When her gown split under stage lights, she lost a scholarship tied to the crown. She confronted organizers, but without footage, no action followed. Humiliated, she withdrew from pageants for months and later testified she believed Elena had sabotaged her and destroyed her opportunity. The stage that August night had been assembled by volunteers. Rented risers were locked together and covered with a thin vinyl sheet stapled underneath. There were no guardrails along the sides. A decision, organizers said, allowed unobstructed camera angles. A seam where two risers met created a slight lip, less than half an inch high. Organizers noticed the uneven join during setup, but deemed it stable. By the final round, witnesses later said the atmosphere between the finalists appeared tense. Both women had advanced to the last two contestants. Phones were raised across the audience as Elena stepped forward for her final walk. As she pivoted near the center seam of the runway, Marisol entered from stage right to join the lineup. Witnesses later stated that Marisol quickened her step. As they crossed paths, witnesses said Marisol placed her foot behind Elena's left heel, creating a brief pivot that interrupted her stride. Her trailing foot caught, and her upper body continued forward while her heel snagged against the uneven seam. The stumble lasted less than a second. Elena threw her arms outward in an attempt to steady herself. With no guardrails along the edge, she veered sideways. The vinyl surface shifted beneath her weight, and she fell off the 4-foot platform. Her head struck the metal corner of a lighting truss before hitting the hardwood floor. The impact echoed across the gymnasium. Audience members rushed forward as she lay motionless. A volunteer called 911. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Elena was unconscious with heavy bleeding from the back of her head and irregular breathing. She went into cardiac arrest at the hospital and could not be revived. The autopsy found a skull fracture at the base of the head and severe brain injury from rapid internal bleeding. Fractures in the upper neck were consistent with a sideways fall. The cause of death was ruled blunt force head trauma from an elevated stage fall. Investigators reviewed footage and confirmed that Marisol's foot made contact behind Elena's ankle. Witnesses stated it did not appear accidental. Marisol Vega, 22, was charged with manslaughter and aggravated assault. In 2018, she was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The court ruled the act intentional, but not premeditated. The pageant committee added guardrails and non-slip surfaces to future events. The case was archived as a fatal fall caused by deliberate tripping during a public competition. Elena's title was awarded posthumously. It was February 9, 2015, in Surabaya, Indonesia. The dental strip along the side street had been quiet for years, with one long-established clinic handling most of the neighborhood's patients. That changed when a new clinic opened just 2 doors down. Cleaner, newer, and offering slightly lower prices. Within weeks, people started switching. Dr. Hassan Minahasa, 54, had run his clinic for over a decade. His days used to be full. Patients trusted him, came back regularly, and recommended him to others. But after the new clinic opened, that started to change. His schedule had gaps. Chairs stayed empty. Patients canceled and didn't return. And most of them weren't just leaving. They were going next door. The new clinic was run by Dr. Rama Lim, 34, a younger dentist who focused on simple things, cleaner tools, shorter wait times, and actually explaining procedures. And somehow it worked. People trusted him fast, and the difference became obvious. While Hassan's clinic slowed down, Rama's kept filling up. At first, it looked like competition. Then it started to feel personal. Hassan began hearing it directly from patients, from staff, from people in the area. Comments about better treatment, cleaner work, and fewer problems. And then it got worse. A patient who had just been treated by Hassan walked into Rama's clinic the next day, in pain. The extraction had gone wrong. There were signs of infection. Rama treated it. And I think that's the part that really hits. Losing a patient is one thing, but watching someone else fix your work right in front of you, that's a different kind of pressure. And people talked about it. That's what pushed it over the edge. It wasn't just losing patients, it was being replaced, openly compared, and talked about. A nearby pharmacy assistant later said patients were saying Rama fixed what the other dentist messed up, often within earshot of Hassan's staff. Hassan confronted Rama weeks before and told him to move move. Rama refused. After that, it stopped being about business. It became about taking back control. On the morning of February 9th, Rama arrived earlier than usual. His clinic normally opened at 2 p.m., but he had scheduled time to organize equipment and review cases. CCTV later showed him entering at 12:07 p.m. The street outside was quiet. Nearby shops were still closed. At 12:19 p.m., Hassan entered through the front door, which had been left partially open while Rama was setting up for the afternoon. He did not check in or speak, walking straight inside while Rama was alone in the clinic. Rama was found near the treatment chair. There were signs of a struggle, but not prolonged. The first strike appeared to come from behind, using a metal instrument stand found beside the treatment chair, heavy enough to cause repeated blunt force injury. Multiple impacts followed, focused on the head and face. It didn't stop there. Investigators noted post-mortem damage around the mouth, including injuries consistent with a tooth being forcibly removed using tools from the tray, not for treatment, but as deliberate post-mortem damage. It wasn't done for treatment. It was deliberate. Emergency services were called at 1:02 p.m. after a neighboring shop owner noticed the clinic door partially open. Responders arrived within minutes, but Rama was already dead at the scene. The autopsy confirmed fatal blunt force trauma to the head, with additional injuries occurring after death. CCTV from nearby shops showed Hassan entering the clinic shortly before the estimated time of death and leaving minutes later. No other individuals were recorded entering during that window. Investigators also found traces of blood on clothing recovered from his clinic, matching the victim. Hassan was arrested later that evening at his clinic. He was charged with murder and, upon conviction, sentenced to life imprisonment under Indonesian law. Both clinics closed within months. It was October 14, 2016, in Asheville, North Carolina. The nights had turned cold, and the mountain roads were dark by early evening. Carla Voss, 34, had lived with Brett Holloway, 37, in a rented house on Caldwell Street for just over a year. The relationship had deteriorated steadily over the summer, and by early October, both of them knew it was finished. They were still living under the same roof while working out who would leave and when. The atmosphere in the house had become cold and largely silent. Brett had grown resentful as it became clear that Carla intended to be the one to stay and that he would be the one to go. In mid-October, Carla arranged to drive overnight to her aunt's home in Knoxville, Tennessee, approximately 3 hours away through the mountains. She mentioned the trip at home the evening before, telling Brett she was leaving Thursday after work and would be gone through the weekend. Brett said nothing. The car she planned to drive was a 2014 Toyota Camry registered in her name, with a factory-installed navigation system. The system stored a small number of saved destinations that could be selected from the main screen without entering an address. Carla had used the system on previous long trips and also to her aunt's house. One of the saved entries was labeled with her aunt's name. Brett was familiar with the car and its navigation system from the relationship. On the afternoon of October 14th, while Carla was at work, he sat in the car in the driveway and accessed the Saved Destinations menu. He deleted the saved entry and replaced it with a new saved location labeled with her aunt's name, directing the route toward an old Forestry Service road, approximately 40 minutes outside Asheville. The road had been closed to public use in 2011 following erosion damage along several sections. Although it still appeared in older navigation map data, it had not been maintained or inspected for years. That evening, Carla came home, changed, loaded a bag into the car, and left shortly after 8 p.m. Not knowing the mountain roads beyond the general highway route, she selected the saved destination from the navigation menu and followed the prompts. The system directed her south along the interstate before instructing her to exit onto a state road, then onto a series of progressively narrower roads leading into the forest. Because she had never driven through that part of the mountains, the route did not immediately seem wrong. The navigation continued to provide turn-by-turn instructions. She followed them. Approximately 45 minutes into the drive, the system directed her onto the old service road. Any old closure markers were difficult to see in the dark. She continued along the road as the pavement narrowed and the tree line closed in on both sides. Several hundred yards in, the road reached a section that had washed out in a landslide years earlier, leaving a steep drop into a ravine. By the time the washed-out section became visible in the headlights, there was not enough distance to stop. The vehicle went over the edge and into the ravine below. Carla's aunt reported her missing the following morning when she did not arrive and calls went to voicemail. Authorities located the crash site later that day after tracing her last known route. Carla Voss was found deceased inside the vehicle. Investigators recovered the navigation system and examined the saved destination used for the trip. The saved destination did not match any address associated with Carla's contacts or travel history. Technical analysis confirmed the entry had been manually input the afternoon of October 14th while Carla was at work. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Brett's vehicle in the driveway that afternoon. Brett Holloway was arrested 11 days later and charged with murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison. It was June 14, 2015, in a covered barangay hall in Parañaque, Philippines, and by the time the afternoon had reached its loudest hour, someone would be lying on the concrete floor losing blood too fast for anyone in the room to stop. Leora Santelmo was 24 and worked the dispensing counter at a pharmacy chain in Las Piñas. People who knew said that she was precise and unhurried, someone who caught dosage errors before anyone flagged them. She had been engaged to Mateo Asis, 27, for just under a year. Mateo ran a small auto repair shop with modest but consistent income. Her father, senior police officer Arvin Santelmo, had made his objections to the match plain to family members in the weeks before the ceremony. I looked for possible reasons why, but my sources don't detail anything. Relatives recalled he had said explicitly that he intended to stop the wedding. No formal complaint was ever filed. That morning, around 80 guests attended. The ceremony passed without incident. By mid-afternoon, the reception was underway. Folding chairs, long tables, a two-tier cake near the front, children moving between seats while adults settled in around them. The hall was a flat, open-sided structure with corrugated metal roofing, backed against a narrow residential lane, the kind of venue that absorbs sound poorly and light not at all. I find it difficult not to notice that several people in that room must have already known what Arvin was capable of, and none of it changed what was coming. Arvin arrived late, still in partial uniform, his sidearm on his right hip. Witnesses near the entrance said he went directly to the perimeter of the room rather than sitting, pausing to speak briefly with relatives and taking a plastic cup from one of the tables before moving on. At least one guest noted he smelled of alcohol. People said that he remained near the edges of the hall for nearly an hour, shifting between posts along the open sides rather than taking a seat before the cake cutting began. No one confronted him about the firearm, later saying they assumed a senior officer was permitted to carry it even at a private event. He approached the couple at the table. A cousin standing nearby said Arvin addressed Mateo directly, asking whether he could support a family. The exchange lasted only seconds before it grew audible to surrounding guests. Leora stepped between the two men and placed her hand on her father's arm. Arvin drew his service pistol in a single motion and fired. The first round struck Mateo in the upper chest, throwing him backward into the cake table. It collapsed beneath him, scattering cake across the floor. Guests at the front fled immediately, chairs overturning as they rushed away. The second shot followed within 1 second, striking Leora in the abdomen at a range of roughly 8 feet. She folded at the waist and dropped to her knees, both hands pulling at the front of her gown, then went down onto her side. The fabric slowly soaked with dark red. Guests toward the back of the hall took several seconds to register what had happened. A metal-roofed enclosure at that range compresses the sound into something the brain takes time to name correctly. A third trigger pull failed to discharge. The brief pause that followed allowed 2 male relatives to close in on Arvin from behind and force his arm upward. A fourth round discharged into the roofing before they brought him to the ground. Mateo remained conscious, pressing one hand flat against his chest wound. A nursing aide in the crowd reached Leora and applied direct pressure using linens pulled from the nearest table. The bleeding did not slow. Witnesses later said her skin had already turned pale and her breathing had become shallow within minutes. That detail, the linens, is the one I can't move past quickly when I read it. I don't think it matters how many times you hear something like that before it stops landing the same way. Multiple guests called emergency services simultaneously. A patrol unit arrived in approximately 6 minutes. An ambulance reached the hall at roughly 11 minutes. Responders noted she had no palpable pulse during transfer to the stretcher. Mateo was transported conscious. Leora was pronounced dead after resuscitation efforts failed, shortly after arrival at a nearby hospital. The medical examiner identified a single gunshot wound to the lower abdomen, with perforation of the small bowel and laceration of a major mesenteric vessel. Death was attributed to acute hemorrhagic blood loss. No additional injuries were documented. Arvin did not resist further when officers detained him at the scene. Mateo recovered after surgery but could not attend the funeral, which was held quietly 2 days later. He later said publicly that he forgives her father. "I can't get past that ending, not just because of what happened, but because Mateo chose to forgive it. A man walked into his own daughter's wedding, shot them both at close range, and still the person who took the bullet says he understands. I don't think most people could arrive at that kind of forgiveness. Definitely not me." It was February 12, 2018. Offices along North Stemmons Freeway in Dallas moved through a routine Monday under fluorescent lights and steady keyboard noise. The carpeted hallway and small break room looked ordinary. Nothing suggested that a routine lunch break would end in a catastrophic equipment failure that would turn fatal. Gary Holt, 46, had worked at the logistics firm for 11 years, rising from dispatcher to middle manager overseeing delivery schedules and warehouse staffing. Coworkers described him as efficient but often dismissive of minor rules. Human Resources records documented repeated complaints that he took clearly labeled lunches from the shared refrigerator, including several belonging to Daniel Kim, 29. Gary denied the accusations and treated them as minor office disputes. Daniel was a junior logistics analyst with no criminal record. He managed routing software and shipment data, and often stayed late during peak periods. To save money while paying student loans, he brought homemade meals daily and labeled them clearly. The break room microwave sat on a laminated counter near a sink and vending machine, plugged into a standard 120-volt outlet. It was a commercial-grade unit, with a steel interior and rotating glass tray. By noon that Monday, several staff members were out, leaving the break room nearly empty. The refrigerator held only a few containers, spaced along the top shelf. Security cameras mounted near the ceiling recorded both the entrance and interior as Gary stepped inside at 12:18 p.m. He removed a foil-wrapped burrito from a paper bag labeled with Daniel's name, placed it in the microwave, closed the door, and set the timer. The machine hummed as the glass tray began to rotate and the interior light flickered on. Seconds later, faint electrical arcing flickered against the steel interior walls. The heating continued as pressure and gas built within the food container. At 12:20 p.m., a sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a sudden rupture. The microwave door forced open and struck the opposite wall while dense smoke and debris pushed outward into the break room. The interior camera captured a brief flash consistent with electrical arcing before the space filled with dark smoke. Gary stepped back, his clothing darkened by heat and residue as he tried to move away from the counter. He staggered toward the sink and collapsed, severe thermal burns visible across his face and upper chest. Employees in nearby offices reported the smell of burning and saw smoke drifting into the hallway as emergency services were called and the building evacuation began. Responders arrived within minutes and found Gary unresponsive on the floor. Burn patterns later indicated he had been standing directly in front of the microwave when it failed. He went into cardiac arrest during transport and was pronounced dead at 12:48 p.m. The medical examiner documented fatal thermal injuries and significant inhalation damage from superheated smoke and gases. The cause of death was ruled homicide, resulting from injuries associated with a modified lithium-ion battery device concealed in food. Investigators recovered damaged battery cells, wiring, and foil fragments from the microwave cavity. Purchase records showed Daniel Kim had ordered battery components weeks earlier, and his computer history included searches related to battery overheating in enclosed environments. He was arrested 3 days later, charged with first-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years. It was November 18, 2017. Wind moved unevenly between the towers of Dubai Marina as a small group gathered on the rooftop of a 52-story apartment building. Below them, the harbor lights shimmered across dark water. Sloan Mercer, 29, worked as a freelance videographer. Base jumping was her outlet. She filmed her jumps and posted them online for a modest following. She organized night jumps for friends and handled the public image. Her former friend, Elena Miraz, 30, had once managed the logistics, weather tracking, landing calculations, rooftop access. Over time, Sloan began presenting their projects as solo efforts. Elena's name disappeared from posts. Small sponsorship deals went only to Sloan. The break became personal when Sloan began a relationship with Elena's longtime partner. Within months, Elena moved out and cut contact. On the night of the jump, Sloan secured rooftop access through a resident. The plan was a delayed canopy deployment with a landing arc toward a mostly empty plaza. The landing area was bordered by metal light poles and decorative fixtures. Wind gusts shifted between buildings. Elena arrived unannounced. Witnesses later said she appeared composed but distant. Sloan allowed her to stay. One member of the group suggested postponing due to crosswinds. Sloan declined. She checked her harness and stepped toward the edge. Elena approached as Sloan positioned herself. According to court testimony, a brief argument followed. When Sloan turned to focus on her exit, Elena shoved her between the shoulders. The push disrupted her stance. Instead of a controlled launch, Sloan stumbled forward off balance. Her body left the rooftop misaligned. Witnesses reported hearing her shout as she fell. During descent, she rotated unpredictably. An unstable exit reduces body control and delays proper positioning. At deployment altitude, she pulled. The canopy opened but inflated unevenly because of her off-axis body position and shifting wind. Instead of stabilizing above her, the canopy surged laterally. She drifted faster than planned toward the edge of the plaza. Witnesses on the plaza later said she appeared to pull at the toggles in an attempt to correct her path. The canopy responded slowly in the crosswind. She struck a metal lighting mast approximately 30 feet above ground. The impact collapsed the canopy and tore several suspension lines. With no lift remaining, she fell the remaining distance. Pedestrians called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Sloan was unresponsive with severe head and chest trauma. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy determined the cause of death was massive blunt force trauma. Injuries included a skull fracture, spinal fractures, ruptured internal organs, and extensive internal bleeding consistent with high-velocity impact following canopy destabilization. Investigators reviewed rooftop security footage and phone location data, placing Elena at the scene. Multiple witnesses confirmed the shove. Elena Meraz was charged with murder under UAE criminal law. Prosecutors argued that pushing someone during a high-risk jump demonstrated intent to cause serious bodily harm. In 2019, she was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The case was recorded in court documents as a fatal fall precipitated by intentional interference during a recreational base jump. The building later restricted rooftop access and increased security. The case was recorded as a fatal fall following intentional interference during a rooftop base jump. It was Monday, November 20th, 2017 in Kuala Lumpur. The university library had settled into its usual rhythm, with a few students moving quietly through the archive room. The space was narrow and tightly organized, lined with heavy steel shelves filled with old records. Nothing about it suggested risk. Ethan Cruz was 20. A second-year civil engineering student who kept things simple and controlled. He wasn't loud or competitive, but he was consistent, the type who planned ahead, double-checked his work, and avoided shortcuts even when no one was watching. That same habit is what pulled him into something he probably didn't expect. A few months earlier, Ethan noticed patterns in exam answers that didn't make sense, details repeating too cleanly across different students. Instead of ignoring it, he documented everything: screenshots, timestamps, names. What he uncovered pointed to a private group chat run by student officers, where answers were being shared before exams. Once he submitted the report, it didn't stay quiet. The investigation quickly focused on Mark Velasco, 22, a third-year student officer with a full academic scholarship tied to his performance. If the case went through, he stood to lose everything: his position, his funding, and likely his place at the university. Around them, things shifted. Conversations grew shorter, and groups became more guarded. Mark never confronted Ethan directly. 4 days before the incident, on November 16th, witnesses saw Mark entering a restricted corridor near the archive room, using a maintenance key issued to a student assistant. He wasn't assigned there and stayed for just over 20 minutes. Nothing appeared different when he left. That corridor gave access to a rarely used service elevator. In the days that followed, the elevator continued operating as expected. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. A few minor irregular stops were reported, but they weren't treated as urgent. That's a tough one. Reports were already coming in, but no maintenance was scheduled. Ethan signed into the archive at 8:22 a.m. and went about his routine. At some point later that morning, he used the service elevator, likely to move between levels or retrieve materials. There were no witnesses inside. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the elevator doors opened at the landing. From inside, it would have looked like a normal stop. There was no visible warning that the elevator car was not properly aligned behind the doorway. Ethan stepped forward. His foot didn't meet a solid floor. It dropped into the open shaft beyond the doorway. As he tried to recover, his weight shifted forward, pulling his body into the space before he could regain balance. There was no room to brace, no time to react. The doors closed and the elevator continued operating. No one saw it happen. The elevator was used throughout the day by students and staff, with the elevator continued operating, though some users later reported uneven stops and slight jolts that were not immediately linked to a serious fault. It wasn't until the next day, after multiple reports of uneven stops and irregular movement came in, that maintenance was finally called. When technicians opened the shaft, they found Ethan's body lodged inside. Emergency services were called immediately, but there was nothing to reverse. The autopsy confirmed fatal traumatic injuries consistent with a fall into the shaft and crushing within the confined space. Investigators later found the elevator's door interlock had been deliberately bypassed, allowing the doors to open without confirming the car's position. Witness accounts and access records placed Mark Velasco in the restricted corridor days before the incident without authorization. The case was reclassified as intentional. Mark was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment, typically 20 to 40 years. I think this is where it starts to feel uncomfortable, because nothing in that last case looked dangerous until the exact second it failed, and that's the part that sticks with me. It makes you realize how much we rely on systems we don't question, especially in places that feel controlled. It was September 3rd, 2015 in Naperville, Illinois. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet street where most residents had lived for years and kept largely to themselves. Carol Simmons, 57, had lived alone since her daughter moved to Minneapolis earlier that spring. She had been diagnosed with epilepsy in her mid-40s and managed the condition with medication, but the seizures were unpredictable and could not always be controlled. Before leaving, her daughter arranged for Carol to receive a trained seizure alert service dog through a certified assistance animal organization. The dog had been matched to Carol based on her specific seizure pattern and had lived with her for several months by the time the trouble with the neighbor began. The dog stayed close to Carol throughout the day. It had been trained to detect subtle physiological changes that often preceded one of her seizures and alert her by pressing against her leg and refusing to move. The warning usually gave Carol several minutes to take emergency medication and move away from hard floors or sharp furniture. On 2 occasions since the dog arrived, the alert had given her enough time to reach a safe position before a seizure occurred. The neighbor, who lived 2 houses down, began complaining in late July. He said the dog sometimes barked in the backyard at night when sounds came from the alley behind the houses. Carol explained that the dog was a medically trained seizure alert service animal and that the alerts could prevent serious injury. A second conversation in August ended badly. Days later, Carol filed a formal noise complaint after the neighbor began playing loud music late at night. The complaint resulted in a municipal fine, and the neighbor blamed Carol for it. On the evening of September 2nd, Carol was inside her home while the dog was in the fenced backyard. At some point, the neighbor approached the fence line from his side of the property and threw several pieces of food into the yard. The dog consumed them. Within an hour, the animal became lethargic and began vomiting. Carol drove him to an emergency veterinary clinic. Despite treatment through the night, the dog died before morning. The veterinarian collected tissue and stomach content samples for toxicology testing. Laboratory analysis later confirmed the presence of a toxic substance. Carol returned home without him. Her daughter offered to come visit, but Carol said it was not necessary. In the weeks that followed, Carol did not experience another seizure, and her medication appeared to be keeping the condition temporarily stable. She contacted the assistance animal organization about obtaining another dog, but was told that matching and training a new seizure alert service animal could take 6 months or longer. Carol believed she could manage in the meantime with medication and caution. 3 weeks later, on the morning of September 24th, Carol experienced a seizure while alone in her living room. Without the dog, there was no alert and no warning. She collapsed and struck her head on the edge of the coffee table as she fell, suffering a severe head injury. That evening, her daughter called repeatedly and received no answer. Concerned, she contacted the police and explained that her mother had epilepsy, lived alone, and had recently lost her seizure-alert dog. Officers conducted a welfare check and entered the home. They found Carol unresponsive in the living room. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be fatal head trauma sustained during an unsupervised seizure. Following Carol's death, investigators revisited the earlier poisoning of the service dog. Detectives documented the prior dispute between Carol and her neighbor over the noise complaint that had resulted in a fine. Veterinary toxicology results confirmed the dog had ingested poisoned food. Further investigation determined that the neighbor had thrown the food into Carol's yard on the night of September 2nd. He was arrested in October 2015. Prosecutors filed charges including criminal damage to a service animal and involuntary manslaughter. Court records later showed he was convicted and sentenced to several years in state prison. It was August 7th, 2017, and the Missouri heat was doing what it does best in early August. Thick, oppressive, the kind of humidity that makes your clothes stick to your back before you've even walked across a parking lot. Branson sits in the Ozark Mountains, and while the elevation helps a little, summer afternoons there can still feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. The tourist district was packed that weekend, families and groups moving between the theaters, restaurants, and amusement attractions that keep the town running. Let me tell you about Stacy Trum. Stacy was 29 years old and worked at a shipping warehouse. From what I've learned, she was the kind of person who showed up for her coworkers. That weekend, she had come to Branson with a group from work after they'd finished a softball game. These weren't close friends necessarily, just people who worked together and decided to make a day of it. You know how those trips go. Someone suggests it, a few people say yes, and before you know it, you're standing in line for rides with people you mostly know from break room conversations. I keep thinking about how she didn't even have to be there. She just said yes to a last-minute invite, and somehow that one small choice ended up changing everything. The group had been walking around for a while when they decided to try the drop tower. This thing lifted riders up about 180 feet before releasing them into free fall. It's the kind of ride that looks terrifying from the ground, but once you're up there, you get maybe 3 seconds to think about what you've done before gravity takes over. The line had grown long, and I can tell you from experience that when lines get long at these places, operators start feeling pressure to move people through faster. Stacy climbed into her seat and lowered the lap restraint. Now here's where things went wrong, and this is important. The restraint didn't fully lock into its final position. It felt secure enough and appeared locked, but it hadn't fully engaged into its final locking position. And when the operator came around to check, he did what's called a visual inspection instead of the required pull check. He looked at each restraint, saw they appeared to be down and locked, and moved on. The ride had already completed several cycles that afternoon without incident. The tower began its slow climb upward. 180 feet doesn't sound like much until you're actually going up. The ground shrinks away, the other rides start looking like toys, and you get that familiar drop in your stomach as your brain starts calculating exactly how far you have to fall. At the top, there's always that pause, that moment where the mechanism holds you suspended, and everyone knows what's coming next. When the release triggered, the car dropped suddenly. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. The sudden acceleration forces riders upward against their restraints as the car falls away beneath them. But Stacy's restraint wasn't fully locked. The force pushed it upward, and it shifted instead of locking her in place. At the bottom, the car hit the pneumatic brakes and rebounded upward. This is also normal. What wasn't normal was that Stacy, no longer properly secured, slipped forward out of her seat during that rebound. She fell from the car and struck the metal platform near the base of the tower. The people waiting in line saw it happen. The impact caused severe head trauma and multiple fractures that were visible to anyone standing nearby. And here's what gets me about this one. The ride finished part of its programmed cycle before the operator even realized what had happened and stopped it. Emergency crews arrived and blocked off the loading area, but there was nothing they could do. Stacy Trum was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation confirmed exactly what you'd expect. The restraint had not been fully engaged and the required pull check had been skipped during the safety inspection. The operator was removed from duty by park management and the ride stayed closed while local officials reviewed training records. It was June 18, 2015. The forest along Washington's Olympic Peninsula was damp from morning rain, and a gravel road leading to a small cluster of rental cabins showed tire tracks slowly filling with water. By dusk, one porch light remained on against the fir trees, the quiet settling in early. 3 months earlier, Dr. Maya Tan, 41, had begun communicating online with a man using an alias and altered photos. Maya was a general surgeon in Tacoma, spending long hours in operating rooms where controlling bleeding and timing each step can determine survival. She specialized in abdominal surgery and was known for steady hands and careful planning. The year before, her younger sister Claire died by suicide after losing more than $60,000 in a romance scam, later linked to Elias Vaughn, 38. Court records later showed that Vaughn of Boise, Idaho, had faced several civil complaints accusing him of financial deception through online relationships. He had no prior criminal convictions. Phone data confirmed that Maya and Vaughn exchanged messages for weeks before arranging a weekend stay at a remote glamping cabin outside Port Angeles, about 12 miles from the nearest paved road with limited cell service. Weather advisories that week warned of steady rain and possible service interruptions. The rental agreement noted the isolation. On June 18th, a gas station camera in Port Angeles recorded Vaughn fueling a rented SUV at 2:12 p.m. A separate roadside camera captured Maya's vehicle on the same highway shortly after. Digital gate logs showed both vehicles entering the property before 4 p.m. A phone placed on the kitchen counter recorded short video clips earlier that evening, showing them unpacking and drinking. A second phone later captured partial video and audio before shutting off, according to forensic review of the devices. Investigators confirmed the events were recorded twice, once before the violence and once during the attack, though the second recording ended abruptly. By nightfall, outgoing calls from both phones had stopped. Toxicology later showed Vaughn had ingested a prescription sedative found in his bloodstream at a level consistent with slowed reactions and impaired movement. Medication packaging was recovered from a trash bin, the bed had been stripped, and investigators documented plastic sheeting beneath the mattress. A compact medical kit was found in the cabin, cleaned but with visible staining inside its hinges. The autopsy documented multiple incisions to the lower abdomen and upper thigh consistent with someone familiar with basic anatomical landmarks. The fatal injury involved the left femoral artery, a major blood vessel in the upper leg. Investigators noted that damage to this vessel can lead to rapid blood loss within minutes. Toxicology confirmed a sedative level high enough to limit coordinated movement without causing full unconsciousness. Blood pooled beneath his body in a pattern consistent with him lying on his back for several minutes, and investigators estimated fatal blood loss occurred within 10 to 15 minutes. Faint heel marks suggested limited movement before collapse. The property manager discovered the body 3 days later and contacted emergency services. The death was ruled homicide due to exsanguination from sharp force trauma. Phone records, gate entry logs, and recovered video files placed Dr. Maya Tan at the cabin during the final hours before Vaughn's death, leading to her arrest. She was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. It was August 22, 2017. The heat outside the strip mall in Mesa, Arizona, lingered long after sunset. Inside a small skincare clinic, the lights remained on. A phone mounted on a tripod faced a treatment chair, its red recording light steady as the room grew quiet. The spa owner, Angela Ruiz, 45, had built her spa into a modest but profitable 3-chair clinic. She had trained as a licensed esthetician after leaving retail management. She was disciplined, image-focused, and determined to grow her brand online. To maintain a minimalist look, she routinely transferred professional-grade acids into identical white refill bottles, removing manufacturer labels. She told clients it was for cleanliness and presentation. 6 months earlier, her assistant, Marisol Vega, 27, reported Angela to county regulators after discovering high-strength trichloroacetic acid stored without labeling and safety sheets. Marisol believed clients were at risk. Inspectors visited but issued only written recommendations. Angela fired Marisol 2 weeks later, stating she was insubordinate. Marisol filed a second complaint with the county within 2 weeks of her termination. Along with the complaint, she submitted dated photographs showing professional-grade acids stored in identical unmarked containers inside the clinic's supply cabinet. A county investigator acknowledged receipt and formally requested updated product logs and safety documentation from the spa. The case remained under administrative review, and no immediate enforcement action was issued. That Tuesday evening, Angela decided to film a promotional chemical peel demonstration on herself. The clinic was closed to clients, but one employee remained in the back office finishing inventory. Angela selected a white bottle she believed contained the neutralizer to pair with a 30% glycolic acid peel. Security footage later showed that 3 days earlier, former employee Marisol Vega, 27, had entered the clinic using a copied access code. Cameras recorded her inside the supply room for approximately 6 minutes. Investigators later determined she handled multiple product containers before leaving. Chemical peels require neutralization to stop the acid reaction. Angela applied the glycolic acid evenly across her cheeks and forehead. After several minutes, she reached for the white bottle she assumed was the neutralizing solution. The recording, later reviewed by investigators, shows her wiping the second solution across her face. Within seconds, her skin flushed deep red. The burning intensified rapidly, forcing her eyes partially shut. She stood abruptly, knocking the treatment tray to the floor, and moved toward the sink. Forensic testing later confirmed the bottle labeled neutralizer contained concentrated glycolic acid. The true neutralizing solution had been moved to a lower cabinet. The clinic's practice of storing professional-grade acids in identical unmarked bottles made visual identification impossible. Angela splashed water on her face repeatedly. The second application significantly increased the acid exposure, causing rapid blistering across her cheeks and neck as water and acid ran into her eyes, forcing them partially shut. In visible distress, she moved toward the rear hallway where a short set of tile stairs led to the staff area. The employee heard a crash. Angela missed a step while descending the stairs and fell forward, striking the right side of her head on a metal stair edge. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later and pronounced her dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death to be blunt force head trauma from a stair fall. The skull fracture caused fatal brain injury. The facial burns were contributing, but not independently fatal. Investigators reviewed earlier supply room footage and identified Marisol Vega handling the bottles. Fingerprints confirmed contact. She was charged with second-degree murder and product tampering. In April 2019, she was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in state prison. Regulators later required aesthetic clinics to keep original labeling and tamper evidence storage. The case was recorded as a homicide resulting from deliberate product tampering that led to a fatal fall. It was May 18, 2016 in Bangkok, where late-morning traffic moved steadily, with buses stopping unevenly, motorcycles weaving between lanes, and passengers gathering along curbside stops, while a nearby loading lane doubled as a public pickup point, where routine transport and controlled movement overlapped without drawing attention. Daniel Cortez, 41, was a private tutor living in Bangkok, working with a small circle of middle school students and keeping a quiet, predictable routine. That changed when he was charged in connection with a minor, one of his own students. The case didn't dominate headlines, but it drew enough attention that every court hearing was watched closely by the people involved. And there was always one person there. Marco Villanueva, 44, the girl's father, never missed a hearing. He didn't speak, didn't react, didn't confront anyone. He just sat, watched, and left. People who knew him said his life had narrowed to the same loop: work, court, home, over and over. And that's what makes this different, because it wasn't sudden, it wasn't emotional. It was something that built quietly, over months, with no release and no resolution. And to me, that kind of routine doesn't calm anything down. It just keeps everything building under the surface. On the morning of the incident, Marco arrived early. CCTV later showed him at the roadside loading area by 9:12 a.m., standing near a structural column beside a blind spot where the lane curved out of view. It wasn't a secure area. It didn't need to be. He didn't move much, he just waited. And honestly, waiting like that almost looks normal in public, until you realize he wasn't waiting for anything to happen. He was waiting to make sure it did. And by that point, it wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about finishing something he had already decided. He stayed there for over 40 minutes, standing in place and occasionally adjusting his shoulder bag without sitting, using his phone or interacting with anyone, blending into a space where waiting wasn't unusual. At the same time, Daniel was prepared for transfer from a nearby courthouse annex, escorted by 3 officers toward a transport van along the roadside lane, with his hands restrained in front. The route followed standard short-distance procedure, relying on speed rather than full isolation, moving through a space that blended controlled movement with public access, under the assumption no immediate threat was present. The transfer was classified as low risk, which allowed movement through a mixed-access area rather than a fully secured route. The escort moved without issue as they exited the building and approached the curbside lane, with surrounding noise from engines, conversations, and passing vehicles masking the shift from secured space to open access. While at approximately 9:58 a.m., they reached the curved section of the lane where visibility narrowed briefly before opening again toward the transport vehicle. As they passed the blind section, Marco stepped out from beside the column about 6 feet away, raised a handgun, and fired once, leaving no time for any meaningful response. He collapsed immediately, with no coordinated movement or attempt to react after impact. One officer reached for his weapon while another moved forward, but Marco did not attempt to flee, instead placing the gun on the ground and raising both hands in a controlled motion. A bystander alerted nearby personnel within seconds, and emergency services were contacted at approximately 9:59 a.m., with responders already positioned within the transport network arriving at the scene within minutes, but there was nothing that could be stabilized or reversed. The autopsy later confirmed a single gunshot wound to the base of the skull, entering from behind at close range, with the bullet disrupting the brainstem, the part of the body responsible for breathing, heart rate, and basic function, leaving no delay and no opportunity for intervention. Daniel Cortez died at the scene. Marco Villanueva was taken into custody without resistance and charged with premeditated murder under Thai law, later receiving a life sentence. Footage from nearby traffic cameras and bystanders spread quickly, drawing attention to the public transport setting where security relied on assumption rather than control. In the months that followed, authorities revised transfer procedures through mixed-access roadside zones, increasing separation and reducing public exposure, closing a gap that had gone unnoticed until May 18, 2016. I think what makes this harder to process is how everything around it still looks routine, like nothing actually changed except one moment that no one could stop. The noise, the movement, even the officers doing their job. It all continues as if the system is still working, and somehow, that's exactly what allowed it to happen. It was July 19, 2014, in Portland, Oregon. The summer heat had settled over the city, and most people in the neighborhood kept their windows open through the evening. Sandra Ellis, 31, had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on Southeast Morrison Street for 3 years. She worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic a few miles away and managed the apartment lease in her name. The rent, utilities, and building correspondence all ran through her. Earlier that year, she had agreed to let a friend named Josh Lowe, 28, move into the second bedroom. The arrangement was informal. His name did not appear on the lease. He contributed a fixed amount toward rent each month, which Sandra used to offset her costs. For the first few months, the arrangement worked without obvious problems. By spring, Josh had fallen behind. One payment arrived 2 weeks late. The next came in short by half. Sandra addressed the issue directly each time, keeping the conversations calm but clear. She depended on the contribution to cover what she owed the building. By early July, with another full month unpaid, she told him plainly that if the balance was not settled within 2 weeks, he would need to find somewhere else to live. Sandra had lived with a severe peanut allergy throughout her adult life. The condition had been formally documented by her physician, and she carried an epinephrine auto-injector with her at all times. A second injector was kept in a kitchen drawer as a backup. Josh had known about the allergy before he moved in. She had explained the risk clearly when the living arrangement was first discussed, and peanut products were never kept in the apartment because of the risk. On the evening of July 18th, another conversation about rent turned into an argument. Josh said the timeline was unreasonable. Sandra responded that the situation could not continue without payment, and that she needed either a firm commitment or a move-out date. The discussion ended without resolution. Shortly afterward, Sandra left the apartment to visit a friend. Earlier that afternoon, she had prepared a container of rice and vegetables and placed it in the refrigerator for dinner when she returned. Josh remained in the apartment alone for several hours and mixed peanut residue into the container. Sandra arrived home shortly after 9 p.m. She reheated the meal, sat down at the kitchen table, and ate without any indication that the food had been altered. Within minutes, she began experiencing symptoms consistent with a severe allergic reaction. Her throat tightened and her breathing became labored. She retrieved the epinephrine injector from the kitchen drawer and administered it before calling 911. Paramedics arrived and transported her to a nearby hospital, but the reaction continued to escalate despite treatment, and she died hours later. Medical staff later confirmed the cause as anaphylactic shock triggered by peanut exposure. Laboratory analysis of the remaining food identified peanut residue mixed into the container. Investigators determined that Josh had been alone in the apartment with unrestricted access to the refrigerator during the hours Sandra was away. His fingerprints were recovered from the container lid. Combined with the earlier argument and his documented knowledge of Sandra's allergy, the evidence became central to the case. Josh Lowe was arrested 6 days later and charged with second-degree murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison. It was August 21st, 2016, at a rented reception hall in Surabaya, Indonesia. Folding chairs, a tiled dance floor, and a bar stocked with champagne bottles that, by 9:40 that night, paramedics would be clearing the parking lot. Varun Sulto was the eldest son in his family. His family said that he often assumed responsibilities his younger siblings avoided, from negotiating conflicts to managing family finances during urgent matters. He routinely stayed behind after gatherings to help clean up, double-checking arrangements that others assumed were already handled. Friends and relatives alike relied on his judgment quietly, the kind of presence that didn't seek recognition, but left a room running smoother simply because he was there. For his cousin's wedding, he had taken 2 days off to coordinate transport for elderly relatives. The bride was his cousin. Her estranged older brother had been formally excluded from the reception following a prolonged family dispute. Varun had been made aware of this before the event. He didn't discuss it with anyone at the venue. He simply stayed close to the bar, close to the entrance, close to wherever the tension might surface first. The hall held roughly 90 guests, most moving between the bar along the north wall and the dance floor. By 9:30, the music was loud enough that when the rear door opened, only a few nearby guests glanced over before looking away. The brother walked in at approximately 9:40. 2 guests near the entrance recognized him but hesitated, assuming at first he had been allowed back in. By most witness accounts, Varun was already moving before the room had fully registered who had entered. He reached the bar alongside 2 cousins. What followed took under 90 seconds. Voices rose. One cousin, a man in his early 30s, grabbed a champagne bottle from the bar and cracked the base against the counter edge. The bottom fell away unevenly, leaving a jagged, unstable edge. Varun stepped toward him, not toward the brother, toward the cousin. He reached for the man's wrist. The cousin pulled back. Both men lost footing on the tile at nearly the same moment as their shoes slipped against a thin layer of spilled champagne that had built up around the bar. The cousin's arm wrenched downward from the combined weight, and the jagged neck drove upward and inward into the left side of Varun's neck, at a close angle created by their bodies collapsing toward each other. It was at the junction of the jaw and collarbone, where the external jugular runs shallow and the carotid sits just beneath it. I want to be direct about what comes next, because I think people underestimate how fast this kind of injury works. Witnesses described an immediate spray of blood reaching the bar surface and the floor simultaneously. Varun's hands came up to his neck. He made a brief choking sound but did not form words. He took 3 steps backward and dropped onto the dance floor, roughly 8 feet from the bar. Guests nearby froze. No one immediately moved to help. People later admitted that no one knew how. Some hesitated, some uncertain whether to touch him, unsure what could stop the bleeding from such a catastrophic wound. The blood spread across the tiles faster than anyone could think through it. Several guests called emergency services, calling out for help that never came. Minutes passed with no direct aid. A few pushed tables back to clear space but did not approach him. Witnesses later said that anyone who might have known basic first aid was not present. The hall was full of people who had never faced a major bleeding emergency. Varun's hands continued to press futilely at his own neck. Paramedics arrived in approximately 8 minutes. Varen was unresponsive by the time they reached him and showed no reaction during transfer to the ambulance. He died on the way. The forensic medical report listed cause of death as exsanguination due to penetrating laceration of the left external jugular vein and common carotid artery. Penetration depth was recorded at approximately 3 inches. The cousin was detained at the scene by other guests. Varen's funeral was held within the same week, attended largely by family. And yet, in the moments that truly counted, no one helped him. The same people who had benefited quietly from his guidance and protection throughout his life had no idea how to return it. It's impossible not to think about that. The man who had spent decades keeping others safe, solving problems, and stepping in for family had no one stepping in for him, and it pains me to know that it killed him. It was October 18, 2016. In a quiet subdivision in Columbus, Ohio, delivery trucks moved past brick ranch homes as late afternoon light settled over narrow driveways and front porches. By mid-afternoon, a large cardboard box sat unopened on one porch in a neighborhood where packages had repeatedly gone missing. Across the street lived Helen Gable, 52, alone in a single-story house facing that porch. She had spent most of her adult life in warehouse retail, unloading freight and sorting returns. After a recent layoff, she struggled to keep up with utilities and property taxes. Over the previous 2 years, neighbors reported missing deliveries. Doorbell cameras showed Helen carrying parcels into her home. She had twice been cited for misdemeanor theft, paid fines, and remained in the neighborhood. Directly opposite her lived Darren Cole, 44, a machinist at a metal fabrication shop outside the city. He frequently ordered specialty tools online and had filed 3 police reports for stolen packages within the prior year. Surveillance clips attached to those reports showed Helen crossing the street shortly after deliveries arrived. Investigators documented a pattern connected to Darren's address. That Tuesday at 2:40 p.m., a box labeled espresso machine was scanned and left on Darren's porch. Shipping records listed the weight at just under 40 pounds. Video later reviewed showed Helen standing near her front window before stepping outside at 3:06 p.m. She crossed the street, lifted the box with visible effort, and carried it into her kitchen. The package remained on her table for several minutes. A neighbor's security camera recorded her separating the top flaps at 3:16 p.m. Another camera across the street captured her leaning over the box. Investigators confirmed the incident was recorded from 2 angles. At 3:17 p.m., residents heard a sharp metallic pop followed by a loud hiss and a scream. Vapor drifted from her kitchen window. Emergency services were called immediately, and police and fire units were dispatched. Inside the home, responders found evidence of a sudden pressurized release. The cardboard box had burst along its seams. A metal cylinder lay ruptured near the table. Cabinets and walls were coated with a dark liquid that had stripped paint and marked laminate surfaces. Helen was on the floor near the stove. Her clothing across the chest and shoulders was heavily damaged, and exposed skin showed extensive chemical injury. Paramedics arrived in about 6 minutes. The kitchen air remained thick with fumes. Helen had severe burns to her face, neck, and upper torso. Her airway was markedly swollen, and her breathing became increasingly difficult before she lost consciousness during transport to a nearby hospital. She was pronounced dead at 3:46 p.m. Investigators later determined the package contained a pressurized container filled with a corrosive drain cleaning solution. When the box was opened, pressure inside the container released the contents upward at close range, creating both liquid exposure and irritating vapor. Laboratory testing confirmed a concentrated sulfuric-based cleaner. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death to be severe chemical burns with inhalation injury. The manner of death was homicide. 2 days later, detectives searched Darren Cole's home and found online searches related to retaliation for package theft, along with receipts for industrial fittings and a pressurized container consistent with fragments recovered from the scene. He was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years plus 8 additional years for weapons charges. The case was cited locally as a revenge killing linked to repeated theft. Neighborhood watch programs expanded, and police issued public advisories warning residents against setting retaliatory traps. It was October 3, 2016. Donner Summit, California, lay under low gray clouds as rain swept across the Sierra Nevada. The pavement was slick, Visibility reduced, and traffic thinned as trucks prepared for the descent toward Reno. Leo Sanchez, 42, had driven freight across Northern California and Nevada for nearly 20 years. He lived in Sparks with his wife and 2 daughters. His logbooks were clean, his inspections consistent. Before dawn, he often idled his tractor briefly in his cul-de-sac while checking straps, air lines, and tire pressure before heading out. His next-door neighbor, Kyle Benton, 35, worked from home. Over the past year, they had clashed repeatedly. Kyle complained about engine noise and fumes. Leo maintained he was operating legally. The dispute escalated when Leo reported Kyle to their homeowners association for blocking the shared driveway during an argument. The association fined Kyle. Friends later said Kyle felt humiliated and blamed Leo for the penalty. On October 3rd, Leo left Sacramento hauling nearly 40,000 pounds of granite slabs secured upright on A-frame racks. His 2012 Freightliner Cascadia passed inspection, though the front left steer tire showed moderate wear. Rain advisories covered the Sierra Corridor that afternoon. Donner's downhill stretch requires careful braking under heavy load. Wet pavement increases stopping distance and reduces traction. Phone location data later placed Kyle driving east toward Interstate 80 that evening. Highway cameras reviewed during the investigation showed his dark pickup within miles of Leo's truck before sunset. Around 6:40 p.m., Leo began the descent as rain intensified and spray trailed behind the trailer. Witnesses said a pickup followed closely, cut in front of the semi, and braked abruptly. Leo downshifted and used controlled braking to maintain stability on the wet grade. The pickup repeated the maneuver, forcing additional braking. Under repeated braking and heavy load, stress built in the worn front left steer tire. At approximately 6:47 p.m., the front left tire failed. Treads separated and debris scattered. The rim struck wet pavement, jerking the steering left. Leo attempted correction, but traction was lost. The trailer jackknifed. The truck crossed lanes, struck the guardrail, and tore through it. The rig plunged nearly 200 feet into a ravine. Granite slabs broke loose and crushed the cab on impact. The drivers called 911 immediately. Highway patrol and fire crews reached the ravine about 35 minutes later. The cab was crushed inward, and Leo was pinned beneath twisted metal and broken stone. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy ruled instantaneous death from catastrophic blunt force trauma, including a fatal skull fracture, multiple rib fractures that collapsed both lungs, and massive internal bleeding. Toxicology was negative. Investigators later placed Kyle Benton's pickup repeatedly cutting in front of Leo's truck before the crash. Vehicle data showed abrupt braking consistent with aggressive driving. Kyle was charged with vehicular manslaughter and reckless driving, convicted in 2018, and sentenced to 16 years in prison. It was May 22, 2018, in Da Nang. The hillside resort overlooked the coastline, with clear views of the sea and only a few guests moving through the property that morning. The infinity pool sat along the edge, its surface calm, with a narrow side channel pulling water back into the system. From a distance, everything looked steady and safe. Lena Torres was 27, a food vlogger known for honest restaurant reviews. She didn't soften her opinions or adjust them to keep business owners comfortable. If something was bad, she said it clearly. That's what built her following, but it also made her a problem for people whose income depended on reputation. She had a heavier build, something viewers sometimes pointed out, and in tighter or slippery spaces, it could affect her balance and how easily she could recover her footing. A few months earlier, she reviewed a mid-range restaurant owned by Carlo Reyes, 56. The video was blunt. She criticized the food, the service, and the pricing without offering much room for interpretation. The review spread quickly. Within weeks, the restaurant saw a drop in customers, reservations slowed, and Carlo began losing steady income. What Lena saw as honesty, Carlo saw as something taken from him publicly and permanently. I know she was just doing her job and saying what she thought, but when someone's entire business depends on reputation, that kind of exposure doesn't feel like feedback. It feels like something being taken away. Instead of confronting her directly, Carlo reached out. In early May, he contacted Lena and suggested meeting in Da Nang, presenting it as a chance to collaborate on a follow-up video that could clarify her review and bring customers back. Lena agreed. She brought her camera gear and told a friend she was heading out for a shoot, expecting a controlled, professional interaction. The resort was privately booked, with no lifeguard and minimal staff nearby. 3 days earlier, a maintenance note recorded that the pool system was running at higher pressure than usual. The infinity pool used a concealed intake port along the side channel. After recent maintenance, part of the protective grate had shifted out of place, leaving a section of the intake more exposed than intended. A secondary intake line had also been temporarily blocked, concentrating more suction through that single point. No repair was scheduled. By the morning of May 22nd, Lena set up her camera near the pool, recording casual footage. Carlo stayed relaxed in frame. Staff later said nothing seemed unusual. At one point, Lena stepped closer to the side channel to adjust her angle. The edge was narrow and wet. She hesitated briefly, then continued. At 10:17 a.m., the camera captured Carlo stepping close behind Lena as she adjusted her position along the narrow, wet edge. His hand moved toward her shoulder at the same moment she lost balance, and the contact aligned with her fall. She dropped into the side channel, her upper body landing over the intake. The suction pinned her against the exposed intake, strong enough that she could not pull free on her own. Each attempt to move broke her leverage, keeping the seal in place and preventing her from pushing herself away. From above, it didn't immediately register as an emergency. Her body was partially submerged along the channel, and from a distance it looked like she was leaning into the water. Carlo stayed on the deck and did not enter. Around 10:22 a.m., a child pointed toward her, but the parent assumed she was fine. At 10:24 a.m., a housekeeper noticed something was wrong and called for help. Staff attempted to pull her free, but the suction held. The pump controls were in a locked room, and the system wasn't shut off until 10:31 a.m. By then, she was unresponsive. Emergency services arrived at 10:49 a.m., and Lena was pronounced dead at 11:38 a.m. The autopsy confirmed drowning. Investigators later recovered footage showing Carlo deliberately pushing her into the intake channel, where her upper body landed over the exposed suction point. He was arrested 2 weeks later, charged with premeditated murder, and in 2019 was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. I think what stays with me here is how it never looks urgent from the outside, even when it already is. It's the kind of situation where people hesitate, not because they don't care, but because nothing clearly signals danger yet, and by the time it does, there's no time left to change anything. It was March 6, 2017, in Bakersfield, California. The mornings were still cool and the industrial streets near the highway were quiet before 7. Raymond Schultz, 58, had operated a small auto repair shop on Oleander Avenue for 19 years. Before opening the garage, he had spent more than a decade working as a mechanic in larger service centers across Bakersfield, building a reputation for careful work and straightforward pricing. Many customers returned year after year, trusting him with both routine maintenance and major repairs. Raymond opened the shop himself every morning before staff arrived, switching on the lights and unlocking the tool cabinets before the workday began. Among the mechanics he hired that winter was Darren Cole, 29. Problems surfaced quickly. He arrived late, ignored routine procedures, and had several disputes with other staff. Raymond warned him more than once about following shop rules, and co-workers later told investigators they had grown uneasy working with him. By mid-February, Raymond had begun considering dismissal. The decision came on February 18th. After closing, Cole remained inside the garage and took a customer's 2013 Chevrolet Silverado from the service bay without authorization. The truck had been brought in for brake work and was scheduled for pickup the next morning. After driving it for roughly 2 hours, Cole returned and struck a curb while turning into the lot, damaging the front suspension. Raymond discovered the damage the following morning. Cole admitted what he had done and was dismissed immediately. Several days later, Cole returned to collect his final paycheck. Raymond told him the truck's repairs had already cost the shop thousands of dollars and said he intended to deduct the amount from Cole's wages. Cole argued that the amount he was owed exceeded the repair cost and demanded to be paid in full. The exchange grew heated in the parking lot before Raymond ended the conversation and walked back inside the building. Cole left without receiving the check. During the weeks he had worked in the garage, Cole had learned how the building operated. Each service bay had a ventilation system that removed exhaust fumes when engines ran indoors. Late on the night of March 5th, Cole returned to the property after closing. He entered through a side door that mechanics often used after hours, switched off the ventilation control unit, and started a customer vehicle left overnight in the center bay. With the fan disabled, exhaust fumes gradually filled the enclosed garage as carbon monoxide accumulated throughout the building. Cole exited through the same door and pulled it shut behind him. Raymond arrived at approximately 6:40 a.m. the following morning, carrying his coffee and keys. He unlocked the side door and stepped into the garage. Within minutes, he collapsed onto the concrete floor near the front of the vehicle. No other employees had arrived yet. Shortly after 8 a.m., one of the shop's mechanics arrived for work and found Raymond lying on the concrete floor. He immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived minutes later and found Raymond unresponsive. Carbon monoxide levels inside the garage were measured at several times the concentration known to cause rapid incapacitation. Raymond Schultz was pronounced dead at the scene later that morning. Investigators found the ventilation control switched off and the center bay vehicle still running. Security camera footage recorded Darren Cole entering the property the previous night and leaving 14 minutes later. Cole was arrested 4 days later and charged with second-degree murder. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison. It was May 30th, 2018, and Memorial Day weekend in North Texas was living up to its reputation. The temperature had climbed into the mid-90s by afternoon, with that thick humidity that makes the air feel like you're breathing through cotton. Arlington sits in the heart of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and holiday weekends bring crowds from all over looking for ways to beat the heat. The local amusement parks were packed, parking lots full of cars from Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Let me tell you about Mara Gleck. Mara was 52 years old and worked in an office, the kind of steady administrative job that keeps businesses running but doesn't make headlines. She had come to the park that day with her adult son, and from what I've learned, this wasn't something she did often. Mara wasn't the thrill-seeker type, but it was a holiday weekend. Her son wanted to spend time together, and sometimes you say yes to things that push you outside your comfort zone. This is the part that bothers me the most. I think most of us have been in that moment where we agree to something we're unsure about just because we love the person asking. They had been walking around most of the afternoon when they approached an inverted roller coaster. This was one of those rides where your feet dangle and you're suspended beneath the track as it loops and corkscrews through the air. There were warning signs posted at the entrance about heart conditions, high blood pressure, and other health concerns, the kind most people glance at and keep walking. Now here's what makes this case different. Earlier that day, operators had noticed the train returning to the station a little faster than it usually did. Not dramatically faster, not enough to trigger a shutdown, but fast enough to stand out compared to normal cycles. A control reset was performed, and the ride continued operating. After the reset, the train was still considered operable, but it stayed near the upper edge of its normal range. Mara climbed into the front row and secured her shoulder harness. The restraint clicked into place, the safety checks were completed, and the train left the station with a full load of riders. For the first part of the ride, everything felt normal. The slow climb up the lift hill, that moment of anticipation at the top, and then the drop. The coaster accelerated down the first drop and entered the first loop at what witnesses later described as high speed. When you go through inversions, your body experiences G-force. The faster you're moving, the more force your body has to handle. And at 52, with a job that kept her sitting at a desk most days, Mara's cardiovascular system wasn't conditioned for that kind of stress. During the second inversion, riders nearby noticed her head drop forward inside the harness. Her body had gone limp. The train continued through the remaining elements, completing the cycle before returning to the station. When the harnesses unlocked, her body fell forward onto the platform. Staff immediately began CPR, but she wasn't breathing and had no pulse. She was transported to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead. The investigation showed the train had completed the course slightly quicker than usual, not a failure, but faster than routine operation. The medical examiner determined Mara suffered cardiac arrest during the high G portions of the ride. Investigators believed the stress of the ride, combined with the slightly higher speed and her own condition, likely pushed her body past its limit. And here's what bothers me about this case. The warning signs were there. The operators knew the train was running faster than they normally saw. They reset it and kept it running because it was still allowed to operate. But those limits are based on average, healthy adults. They don't account for a 52-year-old office worker who maybe hadn't seen a doctor in a while. Park management received a citation for continuing operation after earlier speed complaints. The coaster reopened after inspection, but the incident showed the gap between what's mechanically safe and what's safe for every rider. Mara was just trying to spend time with her son on a holiday weekend. The system worked the way it was designed to, but it was already running a little harder than usual, and for her, that was enough. It was November 22, 2013, in New Haven, Connecticut. Cold rain coated the stone walkways outside a private university as donors arrived at a downtown hotel ballroom for an annual scholarship gala. Inside, technicians tested lighting cues, while staff arranged place settings beneath dim chandeliers. Security cameras covered the entrances and the raised stage, where a podium stood between two projection screens. Professor Malcolm Thorne, 58, had taught political science at the university for nearly 3 decades. He sat on admissions panels and influenced grant decisions that shaped academic careers. Some colleagues viewed him as a respected academic voice, while others questioned how much authority he held over students' futures. Over the previous year, several internal complaints accused him of misconduct toward graduate students. None resulted in criminal charges, and the university placed him under administrative review while allowing him to continue public appearances, including the gala. Among the attendees were 3 former students who had supported the complaints: David Bloom, 28, Paul Beckham, 27, and Dwayne Thomas, 29. Event staff later confirmed that earlier in the afternoon, Bloom and Beckham joined a routine walkthrough near the lighting control area. Maintenance logs noted a brief voltage fluctuation during testing, but technicians reset the system without reporting any further issue. Investigators would later determine that an emergency relay connected to the backup lighting had been manually disconnected during that period. By 8:40 p.m., dessert was cleared, and guests shifted their attention toward the stage. Cameras recorded Thorne approaching the podium as technicians dimmed the chandeliers. At 8:52 p.m., the ballroom lights went out. Later review confirmed the outage lasted 87 seconds, and the disabled relay prevented emergency lighting from activating. In the darkness, chairs scraped and guests began to stand, unsure whether the outage was part of the program or a technical fault. When the lights returned, Thorne lay beside the podium with his shirt soaked in blood across the chest and abdomen. A table near the stage was overturned as guests moved toward the exits in confusion. Investigators later determined that during the blackout, 3 individuals had converged near the podium before stepping back into the surrounding crowd and moving toward the exits. Emergency services were called immediately, and police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Paramedics found Thorne unresponsive with multiple stab wounds to the torso and upper legs. There were no defensive injuries on his hands. CPR was initiated as he was transported to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival despite emergency surgery. The medical examiner documented more than 20 sharp force injuries, several penetrating the abdomen and causing severe internal bleeding. One wound involved the femoral artery, contributing to rapid blood loss. The cause of death was ruled hypovolemic shock due to multiple stab wounds, and the manner of death was homicide. Investigators reviewed hotel security footage alongside a university recording of the speech area. The videos showed 3 figures moving toward the podium during the 87-second blackout before retreating into the crowd as the lights returned. Phone location data placed Bloom, Beckham, and Thomas within a few feet of Thorne at the time of the attack. Trace blood consistent with the victim was later identified on clothing recovered from Bloom and Beckham. Bloom and Beckham were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, and each received 45-year prison sentences. Thomas was convicted of conspiracy and received a 20-year sentence. Following the investigation, the university revised event security procedures and lighting system access protocols, and the case closed after sentencing. It was June 14, 2018. The sea off Barangay San Isidro in Batangas was calm at sunrise, the horizon flat and pale. Small motorized fishing boats drifted beyond the reef line, engines idling as fishermen prepared their nets. The morning air carried the smell of diesel and salt. Ramon Villarta, 48, had fished those waters since he was a teenager. He sold his catch directly at the public market, often pricing his fish lower than others to ensure quick sales. His neighbor, Ernesto Todo Ladera, 51, ran a similar operation. For years, they competed for the same buyers along the shoreline. The rivalry intensified when Ramon began offering discounted bulk prices to restaurant vendors. Toto accused him of destabilizing the local market and driving profits down for everyone. Arguments at the dock became routine. 6 months before the incident, the tension turned physical. Witnesses said Toto threw the first punch, but Ramon retaliated using a metal hook meant for hauling nets. Toto sustained a fractured jaw and broken ribs. He was hospitalized for weeks. No charges were filed, but the bitterness lingered. After recovering, Toto returned to fishing but avoided direct contact. Friends later testified that he often spoke about humiliation and the income he lost while injured. He began spearfishing again, saying it required fewer supplies and less fuel than net fishing. On the morning of June 14th, both men launched before sunrise, their boats drifting within a few hundred yards of each other, near a shallow coral shelf known for grouper. Other fishermen later said tension was visible when they crossed paths, and witnesses noted Ramon lifting a net heavy with early catch while appearing to laugh. Around 7:20 a.m., Toto maneuvered his small motorized fishing boat closer, appearing to check his line, as witnesses heard raised voices over the water and later described a heated exchange tied to their ongoing rivalry and past conflicts. The distance between their boats narrowed to roughly 10 to 15 feet, as two nearby fishermen reported seeing Toto lift his spear gun and point it toward Ramon's vessel, though whether it was meant as a threat or something more could not be determined with certainty before the spear discharged. The steel-tipped arrow traveled across the short stretch of water and struck Ramon in the upper chest, slightly left of the sternum. The impact drove him backward against the side of his boat. The shaft pierced through his torso, protruding behind him. Blood spread quickly across his shirt and pooled on the wooden deck. Witnesses described Ramon attempting to push himself upright before collapsing forward. One fisherman started his engine and steered toward him, while another used his phone to call for help as nearby boats moved closer. Toto dropped the spear gun onto the floor of his small motorized fishing boat and did not fire again. Ramon was brought to shore within 15 minutes. Local community emergency responders initiated CPR while waiting for an ambulance, but he showed no signs of recovery. He was pronounced dead upon arrival at the provincial hospital. The autopsy determined the cause of death as penetrating chest trauma. The spear had entered between the ribs, punctured the left lung, and severed a major blood vessel near the heart. Rapid internal bleeding led to hypovolemic shock within minutes. Police recovered the spear gun and steel arrow from the scene. Multiple fishermen provided sworn statements describing the argument and the shot. Charged Ernesto Ladera, age 51, with homicide. In 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in prison. The court ruled that firing a spear gun at close range constituted intentional deadly force, regardless of whether the act was pre-planned or driven by anger. It was July 30th, 2013, in a provincial city in Southeast Asia. The stadium was full for the regional finals, and as the last whistle blew, the crowd moved steadily toward the exits. Vendors packed up, voices echoed across the concrete, and nothing seemed out of place. Daniel Kim, 45, had been officiating games like this for 11 years. He was steady, predictable, and trusted, the kind of referee who kept things controlled even when tensions ran high. Off the court, he stayed quiet. Earlier that year, he had filed a report identifying a small group involved in illegal betting tied to game outcomes. He named them directly. The report didn't go public, but it circulated enough that the people involved knew exactly who had written it. And that's where this stops being random, because they didn't forget. The final game that night drew over 3,000 people. Two of the four main exits were partially narrowed by temporary barriers, creating natural bottlenecks as the crowd moved out. Daniel remained near the sideline after the game, gathering his materials beside a fixed concrete post along the perimeter. He always left a few minutes later than everyone else, and that routine didn't change. At approximately 8:41 p.m., two men positioned near the east exit began moving against the flow, not shouting randomly, but pushing deliberately into the outgoing crowd. Witnesses later said it didn't feel like panic at first. It felt controlled, targeted, and that's the part that stands out. Because they weren't trying to scatter everyone, they pushed against the flow in a way that disrupted movement near the exit, creating sudden congestion that spread back through the crowd toward the sideline. I've always felt fine in crowds, like as long as everyone's moving the same way, nothing really goes wrong. But when someone forces that movement to change, even slightly, it doesn't take much to turn it into something else. Within seconds, the flow shifted. People near the exit slowed and turned, reacting to something they couldn't fully see, while those behind them kept pushing forward in the original direction. The pressure didn't build all at once. It started gradually, then intensified with each second. It moved through the crowd in waves, transferring force from one group to the next, with no clear starting point, and no way for anyone inside it to understand what was happening. Everyone was reacting, but no one was in control. That movement wasn't random. It pushed through the sideline area where Daniel was positioned, increasing density around fixed structures. At approximately 8:43 p.m., that pressure reached the sideline. It came from behind him, not as a single hit, but as a surge of bodies shifting at once. He stepped to recover, trying to adjust his balance the way anyone would in a crowd, but there was nowhere to go. The space around him had already closed. His right side collided directly with the edge of the concrete post beside him. Witnesses later described how his head struck the edge of the concrete post at an angle, and the force of the impact caused immediate collapse. There was no attempt to brace, no visible reaction. By the time the movement around him slowed and space opened, he was already on the ground, unresponsive. Emergency services were called at 8:44 p.m. and medical staff reached him within minutes. He was transported to the hospital but was pronounced dead at 10:15 p.m. The autopsy confirmed a fatal head injury, blunt force trauma to the temporal region, causing rapid internal bleeding and immediate loss of consciousness. Investigators later reviewed multiple angles of footage and tracked the crowd movement back to its origin. The two men at the east exit weren't reacting to anything. They were initiating it, pushing against the flow in a way that disrupted crowd movement and caused dangerous compression. Phone records and earlier reports linked them directly to the betting group Daniel had identified months before. This wasn't panic, it was pressure, built deliberately and guided through a space where no one could see it forming until it reached him. Both men were arrested, charged with murder, and later convicted. And when you step back from it, that's what closes the loop. Nothing in that moment looked like a direct attack, but every part of it was already set in motion. No weapon, no confrontation, just a system they disrupted in a way that made serious harm likely, until the outcome wasn't chance anymore. It was a situation they created in a confined, high-pressure space. It was September 3rd, 2015, outside Lexington, Kentucky. Late summer heat still lingered across the rolling pasture land, and the narrow county roads were quiet after sunset. Gerald Marsh, 58, lived alone in a small ranch-style house on a 15-acre property his family had owned for decades outside Lexington, Kentucky. Years earlier, the land had been used to keep several horses, with a small training barn that Gerald and his father had built together. Even after the animals were gone, the pastures and fencing remained, and nearby horse farms had begun showing interest in the land. Gerald had spent most of his life working at a sheet metal plant, before severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease forced him to stop. By 2014, the illness had progressed to the point that he could not maintain safe oxygen levels while sleeping, and doctors prescribed nightly oxygen therapy. A concentrator sat beside his bed each night, feeding oxygen through clear tubing connected to a nasal cannula he wore while he slept. The machine's front panel displayed the flow setting as a small floating ball inside a clear tube. Gerald's prescription required 2 liters of oxygen per minute. Without it, doctors said his oxygen saturation would gradually fall during the night. Gerald had one brother, Dennis Marsh, 61, who lived about 40 minutes away. When their father died in 2014, the farmland was left without a will specifying ownership. Dennis wanted to sell the property to a neighboring horse farm, looking to expand its pasture land. Gerald refused, arguing the land should stay in the family. The disagreement quickly turned bitter, with lawyers becoming involved and communication nearly stopping altogether. Relatives later said the dispute had reached a point many families recognize, when shared land becomes less about property and more about who refuses to give in. On the evening of September 3rd, Dennis arrived at Gerald's house shortly after 6 p.m. He told his brother he needed to collect several old horse tack boxes their father had stored in the garage. Gerald allowed him inside. They spoke briefly in the kitchen before Dennis moved down the hallway toward the back of the house. For several minutes, he was alone near the bedroom. Before leaving, Dennis stepped into the room and quietly adjusted the oxygen concentrator. He reached down and turned the flow meter knob until the floating indicator ball dropped far below Gerald's prescribed 2-liter setting. The machine continued running normally, its compressor humming and indicator light glowing, and from across the room nothing appeared unusual. Dennis left shortly before 7 p.m. Gerald locked the house, fed his dog, and went to bed later that night at his usual time. He placed the nasal cannula in position and turned off the bedside lamp as the concentrator continued running beside him. Because Gerald's disease was in its final stage, He could not maintain safe oxygen levels without the device operating correctly. Through the night, his blood oxygen gradually declined. The reduction was slow and silent. Gerald never woke. The following morning, a neighbor called 911 after Gerald's dog barked continuously for more than an hour. Emergency responders arrived and found Gerald unresponsive in bed. The nasal cannula remained in place and the oxygen concentrator was still running. While checking the equipment, one of the paramedics noticed the flow meter was set far below the level marked on the prescription label. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and Gerald Marsh was pronounced dead at the scene. During the medical examination, technicians confirmed the concentrator had been set far below the prescribed oxygen level and that the machine had no mechanical fault. Investigators later learned that Dennis Marsh had visited the house the previous evening. When questioned by detectives, Dennis admitted he had lowered the oxygen setting during the visit. The death was ruled a homicide, and Dennis Marsh was arrested and charged with murder. He later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. It was September 3rd, 2017, on a private resort island in the North Malay Atoll, Maldives, where a destination wedding had drawn over 200 guests to a stretch of white sand and glass flat water, and where a decision made weeks earlier by someone would end catastrophically. Wen Zhang had spent 51 years as a textile production supervisor in Shenzhen, retiring only when her health required it. A stroke 2 years prior had taken the use of her left side, leaving her dependent on a wheelchair and a rotating team of family caregivers. She was known among relatives as meticulous and unsentimental, someone who kept her medical appointments without complaint, and who, according to her daughter, had not cried in front of anyone since her husband's funeral in 2009. When her granddaughter invited her to their wedding, Wenli agreed. Her grandson-in-law's family had arranged the event, a multi-day private island celebration capped by a helicopter arrival for the groom's party on the final evening. A custom viewing platform had been constructed adjacent to the resort's helipad, extending roughly 60 feet over a shallow coral shelf in about 4 feet of water. I guess weddings doesn't happen much in one's life, but I still think this is a bit excessive. The platform had a posted maximum capacity of approximately 40 people, printed on a temporary placard at the access point. Because of Wenli's mobility limitations, family members had positioned her wheelchair near the center of the platform before other guests arrived, reasoning it was the safest location. A resort attendant had earlier advised keeping mobility-impaired guests closer to the fixed deck connection, but the suggestion was not followed once the crowd began to gather. That decision, made with total sincerity, placed her directly over the span that would fail first. The platform's composite decking sat on pilings driven into the coral shelf below, a surface type that resists uniform pile penetration, creating uneven load distribution across the structure from the moment construction was completed. Several of the support points had required adjustment during installation due to variable substrate resistance, resulting in measurable differences in load transfer across spans. Decorative lighting and electrical conduit had been mounted to the underside of several deck sections, adding weight that was never formally accounted for. No independent structural assessment of the guest load configuration appears to have been conducted prior to the event. The first thing witnesses heard was a single dull crack, not sharp, not explosive, the sound of composite material separating under sustained load. It lasted less than a second. The center section dropped approximately 18 inches in one abrupt motion. Wenli's wheelchair tilted forward with the collapsing deck. She entered the water chair first, still secured by her lap belt, with sections of paneling coming down around her. Other guests fell in both directions as the failure spread outward from the center. Several grabbed for the remaining platform edge and pulled themselves back. Others went in alongside large panels and loose sections of railing. Electrical conduit tore from the underside of the structure and trailed into the water in loose coils, around people still trying to determine which way was up. Power to the lighting circuit cut out almost immediately as the lines separated. Most guests surfaced within seconds. Wenli did not. A guest who had been standing 3 feet from her dove repeatedly in the area where the chair went under. He later told investigators that visibility dropped to near zero almost immediately. Disturbed sand and debris had made the water completely opaque. Floating panels shifted across the surface above him, blocking what little light remained. He surfaced 4 times without locating her. Resort staff deployed small boats within approximately 5 minutes. Lifeguards and dive-trained staff entered the water within the first 2 minutes from the shoreline side of the platform. An organized rescue effort began around the 10-minute mark. Wenley was recovered from the seafloor roughly 18 minutes after the collapse, still secured to the wheelchair by the lap belt, unresponsive. Paramedics on site attempted resuscitation for several minutes. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Wenley's death was recorded administratively as accidental drowning, a classification that does a quiet and considerable amount of work. I'm actually surprised no one with structural credentials approved that platform before 120 people stood on it over open water. You can have all the money in the world, and stupid still seeps through. It was August 18, 2019. On Detroit's east side, a cleared block of former storefronts sat behind temporary fencing, graded flat for new construction. An automated concrete printer moved along steel rails, laying thick gray lines across a slab where structural walls were planned. The project was led by Travis Knox, 39, a local developer known for buying distressed properties and converting them into compact apartment units. He worked under tight budgets and strict timelines. The block once included a locksmith shop run by Arthur Mendez, 71. 6 months earlier, Knox's company acquired the property through foreclosure, and Mendez lost the shop he had operated for decades. The dispute led to civil filings and tense exchanges at public meetings. That afternoon, Knox scheduled a walkthrough for investors. The printer had already begun forming the first structural columns. A supervisor noted minor sensor issues caused by dust and suggested pausing operations, but Knox chose to keep the system running to demonstrate progress. Access logs later showed the control software had been entered the previous evening using credentials assigned to Arthur Mendez, who had been granted temporary access weeks earlier to remove fixtures from his former shop. Investigators found several proximity sensors had been disabled, and the emergency stop delay extended by several seconds. Because the changes were made through authorized credentials, the system did not flag them. At 3:42 p.m., Knox stepped inside the marked boundary to demonstrate how closely the printer could operate near a corner. 2 investors stood near the fence, and a laborer remained by the mixing truck. A phone mounted on the fence recorded the walkthrough, and a fixed camera captured the active zone from above. The nozzle moved at waist height, laying a band of wet mix. As Knox stood near the inside angle of a forming wall, the printer arm pivoted and advanced. Under normal settings, the proximity system would have paused the motion. It did not. Knox stepped backward, but earlier layers, nearly 18 inches high, confined him in the corner. The nozzle advanced into his space, pinning him against the partially formed wall. The pump continued feeding concrete at a steady rate. Wet concrete accumulated around his boots as the printer continued laying layers. As additional passes were completed, the material built upward, gradually trapping his lower body. A subsequent programmed pass deposited material across his midsection, further restricting movement. Workers pressed the emergency stop at 3:44 p.m., but the printer continued briefly before shutting down. By then, the concrete had reached his chest, restricting movement and breathing. Emergency services were called immediately. Fire crews arrived within minutes and began removing sections that were still soft, but the lower portion had already begun to harden. Using cutting tools and shovels, crews freed him from the partially formed column. Paramedics assessed him and found no pulse. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was traumatic asphyxia caused by compressive force. The weight and pressure of the concrete prevented his lungs from expanding, leading to suffocation. The report also documented rib fractures and crushing injuries to the lower torso. The manner of death was ruled homicide, after forensic engineers confirmed the safety systems had been intentionally altered. Arthur Mendez was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 25 years. Construction stopped immediately, and the partially formed structure was removed and preserved as evidence before the site was cleared. It was March 14, 2016. The Community Fitness Center in Columbus, Ohio, moved through its usual Monday rhythm. The squat racks faced a mirrored wall, security cameras fixed above them in silent, steady angles. From the floor, nothing suggested that one lift would later become evidence. Jason Miller was 38 and worked in insurance claims processing for a regional firm. He was methodical and precise, the kind of man who documented conversations and saved receipts. After his divorce the previous year, he focused on rebuilding his health with the same discipline he applied to his job. He logged every workout in a small spiral notebook, tracked his calorie intake, and avoided unnecessary conversation on the gym floor. Structure gave him control. 3 months earlier, Jason filed a formal maintenance complaint after noticing loose hardware on one of the squat racks. He photographed the misaligned safety arm and emailed management with timestamps. The complaint triggered a corporate inspection and resulted in a written reprimand for the gym's floor manager, Derek Harlan, age 46. Harlan's quarterly performance bonus was temporarily frozen. According to later court filings, the atmosphere shifted after that review. Staff schedules changed, and Jason mentioned to a coworker that interactions with management had grown tense. He continued training there each evening. The rack Jason used that night had adjustable safety arms secured by removable steel pins. Maintenance logs showed replacement pins had been requested, but not yet installed. Surveillance footage showed Jason loading 3 45-pound plates on each side of the bar, totaling 315 pounds. Another member offered to spot him. Jason declined, as he routinely did. Jason unracked the weight and stepped back. He inhaled and descended. At the bottom of the lift, the bar drifted forward slightly. When he failed the ascent, he attempted to dump the bar backward onto the safety arms. The right arm held, the left dropped. The bar tilted violently. Nearly the entire load shifted forward across the base of his neck. Witnesses heard a sharp metallic impact as the left safety arm dropped against the frame, followed by a strained choking sound. The bar forced his chin to his chest and pinned him face down against the mat. His arms moved briefly but without coordination. 2 members rushed forward and lifted the unloaded end first while another stripped plates. The bar rolled free within seconds. Jason did not move again. A trainer called 911 at 7:42 p.m. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. CPR was initiated, but there was no spontaneous breathing or pulse to restore. Trial footage showed the left safety pin was not fully inserted before Jason lifted. Earlier video that evening confirmed it had been properly seated during another member's set. Between that lift and Jason's attempt, surveillance showed floor manager Derek Harlan lingering at the rack and manipulating the safety arm for several seconds, partially disengaging the pin before stepping away. Forensic analysis found no defect or metal failure. The pin slipped because it was improperly engaged. Text messages recovered from Harlan revealed anger over Jason's complaint and references to retaliation. The coroner determined Jason died from fractures of the C5 and C6 vertebrae that severed his spinal cord and stopped his breathing. In 2018, Harlan was charged with involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide. A jury convicted him of reckless homicide, citing deliberate interference and foreseeable risk. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. The full sequence was recorded on security cameras and used as central trial evidence. The gym settled a wrongful death claim, implemented stricter inspection policies, and restricted staff from handling active equipment. The court described the case as a fatal act of workplace retaliation involving equipment tampering. It was March 12, 2016. The industrial bakery in Cebu City ran its overnight shift as usual, with flour dust in the air, ovens cycling steadily, and workers moving in routine. Nothing stood out or suggested anything had changed. Quiet but dependable. That was Arvin Salcido, 29, a packaging line worker who had been with the bakery for 3 years. He lived in Mandaue, taking 2 jeepneys before dawn to reach the facility, sending most of his pay back to his mother in Bohol. He kept to himself, avoided complaints, and worked steadily through each shift. Like most workers on the line, he ate from the cooling racks during downtime. It saved money, and no one questioned it. And if we're being honest, if you're standing around fresh bread all night, you're probably doing the same thing. Supervisors described him as reliable and detail-oriented. In 2015, he attended safety meetings and once suggested adding biometric locks to the ingredient storage rooms, an idea that was noted but not implemented. Months earlier, he had reported seeing Joel Mirasol, 30, taking product out through a side exit. The complaint went through management, and Arvin signed as a witness. Joel was suspended suspended, but his access card remained active. According to CCTV reviewed later, Joel entered the facility at 2:14 a.m. on March 12th during a shift overlap, when movement at the loading bay pulled attention away from internal areas. Days earlier, his suspension had been discussed openly on the floor, with supervisors questioning him in front of other workers and limiting his access. Co-workers later said the incident spread quickly, and Joel became the subject of quiet conversations and avoidance on the line. Security later stated that familiar workers were often waved through during these periods without strict badge checks. He went directly to the ingredient storage room and stayed inside for 4 minutes. Instead of contaminating ingredients before baking, Joel moved to the cooling area after production began. Investigators later determined he applied a concentrated liquid organophosphate pesticide to a small number of finished pieces at the edge of the rack, targeting items likely to be picked up casually while they cooled, avoiding heat that could reduce potency. By 5:30 a.m., the first batch had finished baking and was cooling on the racks. Workers on the packaging line noticed something slightly off, not strong, not enough to alarm anyone, just a faint metallic edge beneath the usual smell of yeast and toasted crust. It came and went depending on where they stood, blending into the heat of the ovens and the normal smells of production. 2 workers mentioned it briefly. One assumed it was leftover cleaning residue reacting to heat. The line didn't stop. Arvin picked up a piece from the cooling rack. He took a bite, paused for a second, and said the taste wasn't right, like something chemical. A co-worker nearby heard it, but early batches sometimes came out uneven, too salty, too dry, slightly off. It wasn't unusual enough to raise concern. He finished the piece anyway and went back to work, handling the rest of the batch as the shift continued. Over the next several minutes, subtle symptoms began to develop. Arvin slowed down at the line, missing the alignment of a tray and not correcting it right away. He wiped his face, then steadied himself against the conveyor for a second longer than usual. His movements became less coordinated as his breathing grew heavier and uneven. At approximately 6:10 a.m., he stopped moving mid-task. He set down a tray unevenly, his hands hovering slightly above it, as if waiting for something to respond. A co-worker turned and saw his expression, unfocused, slack, not tracking anything in front of him. The tray slipped from his hands. It hit the floor and scattered bread across the line. Arvin staggered into the metal shelving and collapsed. By the time co-workers reached him, his body was already seizing, limbs rigid, breathing strained. Emergency services were called immediately, but he was already unresponsive and later pronounced dead. The autopsy confirmed organophosphate poisoning, a pesticide applied to finished bread on the cooling rack. The chemical shut down his nervous system, stopping his breathing. During the investigation, CCTV footage showed Joel Mirasol entering restricted areas before production and moving through the cooling section without authorization. Residue matching the pesticide was later found on item S he had accessed. Joel was arrested 2 days later and charged with murder with treachery. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to reclusion perpetua of 20 to 40 years imprisonment under Philippine law. Within a month, the bakery installed biometric locks, the same fix Arvin had suggested a year earlier. By then, the system had already failed once. It was June 18th, 2016, and the summer heat had settled over northern Ohio the way it always does in mid-June. Thick, humid, the kind of air that sticks to your skin the second you step outside. Sandusky sat along the Lake Erie shoreline, and on weekends like this one, the local amusement parks pulled in crowds from all over the region. Families, couples, groups of friends, all looking for a few hours of noise and adrenaline before the sun went down. Now let me tell you about Diane Phipps. Diane was 41 years old, worked in a dental office, and from everything I've gathered, she was the kind of person who showed up for her family. That weekend, she had made the trip out to Sandusky with her brother and his 2 kids. This wasn't some big vacation. It was just a summer day trip, the kind where you pack the car, grab some snacks, and try to make a good memory with the people you care about. And honestly, I think that's what makes this one hit harder. She wasn't even on a ride. The group had been walking through the park for most of the afternoon, hitting different attractions, grabbing food, doing the usual. At some point, they ended up near the exit path of one of the high-speed spinning rides. There was a waist-high metal fence separating the spectator area from the ride zone, and people were standing around watching. Diane stopped about 12 feet from the fence and pulled out her phone to film the ride as it spun at full speed. Her brother and the kids were nearby. Nothing about this moment felt dangerous. She was just standing there, recording. Now here's what she didn't know, and what honestly nobody in that crowd knew. Earlier that same day, Operators had paused the ride after noticing unusual vibration coming from one of the outer cars. A maintenance worker was brought in and tightened several bolts on a side access panel. During the check, the inspection noted stripped threads on 2 of the fasteners. A temporary fix was applied, but the panel wasn't fully secured, and the supervisor cleared the ride for continued operation. The ride ran several more full-speed cycles after that, each one putting stress on a panel that was no longer properly secured. So Diane is standing there, phone up, watching the ride spin. And as it hits maximum rotation, the centrifugal force starts doing exactly what physics says it will. That loose panel begins shaking violently. The 2 remaining bolts can't take it. They tear free, and a rectangular steel panel rips clean off the car. And I'll be straight with you, this is the part that gets me. A maintenance worker actually handled those stripped bolts, saw they weren't right, and the ride still went back into operation with people on it. I really can't make that make sense in my head. It clears the fence, flies into the spectator area, and strikes Diane on the right side of her head. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete. Her skull fractured from the panel, and the back of her head hit the pavement hard as she fell. Blood began pooling beneath her almost immediately, and the ride, it kept spinning. For several seconds, nobody in the control booth knew what had happened. It wasn't until people in the crowd started screaming that the operator hit the emergency stop. I want you to sit with that for a second. She was 12 feet behind a fence. She wasn't on the ride. She was filming it. Park staff reached her within minutes and started CPR when she stopped breathing. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Diane Phipps was pronounced dead. The investigation that followed confirmed what should have been obvious before the ride ever restarted. The access panel was missing fasteners that should have been replaced before the attraction went back into service. Inspection notes showed the stripped bolts had been documented, but the ride was not locked out after a supervisor approved continued operation. The operator on duty was removed from ride assignment after inspection logs were reviewed, and the ride stayed shut down for the rest of the season. It was May 12, 2018, in a rented ballroom on the second floor of an event venue in Atlanta, Georgia, when a family heirloom that had survived 2 previous weddings would be the reason why the next one halted. Sonara Hollis was 29 years old and worked as a dental hygienist at a mid-sized practice in Decatur. She had known the bride since their first year of college, 11 years compressed into the single title of Maid of Honor. Throughout the reception, she had been the one quietly repositioning centerpieces, flagging the coordinator when the timeline slipped, making sure nothing came apart. Her mother later told investigators she was the kind of person who never fully sat down at other people's events. That evening, she was wearing a floor-length blush gown and heels that had been giving her trouble since before the ceremony. The groom's family had brought a military-style ceremonial saber to the reception, a piece passed through the family across multiple generations. A relative had transported it in a protective sleeve and handed it to the groom near the cake table moments before the cut, with no formal inspection by venue staff. Several guests commented afterward that the blade appeared noticeably sharp for something described as ceremonial. What I keep thinking about is that nobody in that room thought to question it, despite noticing it. I have no words for the following sequence of events about to unfold. The couple moved to the cake table to sustained applause. Sonara had stepped slightly forward from her position to the table's left. Witnesses said she appeared to be shifting out of a photographer's sightline. She was already partially crouched near the base of the table, reaching down to steady the heel of her shoe that had slipped loose on the polished floor. Her upper body remained lowered at table height as the groom raised the saber, placing the back of her neck within the arc of the blade. It was a recipe for disaster no one saw. A guest moving laterally behind the groom made contact with his right shoulder at the moment the downward arc began. Witnesses described it as a brush, the kind of incidental contact that happens continuously in any crowded room. The groom's arm had already committed to the motion before the contact occurred. The saber redirected mid-arc. The deflection lowered the blade path by several inches and shifted it slightly left of its intended line toward the cake. It was not a glancing blow. The blade struck across the upper back of Sonara's neck at an oblique angle, continuing through soft tissue and contacting the upper cervical spine. Witnesses closest to the table described a sound that several initially misidentified. She collapsed forward immediately, without any attempt to brace herself, her shoulder catching the edge of the table as she went down. The room went silent. Witnesses described the pause as a full second before anyone moved. A guest near the back said she thought something had been knocked over. The person standing directly across the table saw Sanara on the floor and began screaming. A guest with medical training reached her within seconds, checked for responsiveness, and began issuing instructions to bystanders nearby. He continued working. Investigators noted later that the nature of the injury left no clinical window for intervention. I don't think there's a version of being the person who stays composed in that room that doesn't cost you something permanent. Emergency services were contacted within seconds of her collapse. Venue staff cleared the immediate area. Paramedics arrived in approximately 7 minutes. Sanara was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic cervical spine trauma, involving transection at the C1 to C2 level with associated vascular injury. The injury pattern was consistent with a single high-velocity blade strike to the posterior cervical spine. Death was near instantaneous. Authorities ruled the incident accidental. Still, a civil case was filed in the months following and settled privately, with terms undisclosed. The groom's family made no public comment. Apparently, the couple separated in the following year, according to court filings related to the civil case. The saber was retained as evidence and, to the family's knowledge, never returned. I've spent time with a lot of stories like this, and this one sits differently. Not because it was more violent than others, but because of how completely unremarkable the moment was right before it happened. A shoe strap, a crowded room, one person brushing into another at the wrong fraction of a second. That's all it took. It was February 11, 2016, in Columbus, Ohio. The office buildings along the downtown corridor were still dark at that hour, and the lobbies were quiet well before the workday began. Diane Mercer, 41, worked as a contracts administrator for a property management firm, occupying the 4th and 5th floors of a commercial office building. She had held the position for 6 years, and was known among her colleagues for her reliability and attention to process. She arrived each morning between 6:45 and 7 a.m., well before most of her team, and spent the early hour reviewing contracts before the phones began ringing. The building was maintained by a small in-house facilities team. Among them was a maintenance technician named Gary Pruitt, 46, who had worked in the building for 4 years. Pruitt was responsible for building systems including HVAC, electrical panels, and elevators. He held a valid elevator maintenance certification and had authorized access to all mechanical rooms and control cabinets in the building. Over several months in late 2015, Diane submitted multiple written complaints to building management about Pruitt's work practices. She had seen him leave equipment panels unsecured in common areas and skip the required sign-in procedure for elevator maintenance, both violations of the building's safety protocol. In November, she filed another report after noticing a service door propped open near a live electrical panel during business hours. Management reviewed the complaints and issued Pruitt a formal written warning in December, stating that further violations could lead to suspension or termination. Pruitt blamed Diane directly. Her name appeared on the reports, and he knew she was responsible for the escalation. He also knew her routine, the early arrivals, the same elevator each morning, and the nearly empty lobby before 7. On the evening of February 10th, Pruitt stayed in the building during scheduled after-hours maintenance. The elevator control cabinet was locked behind a service door in the lobby and could only be opened by certified technicians. Modern elevators have safety systems that stop the doors from opening unless the elevator car is at that floor. Pruitt had the access and knowledge to interfere with the system. Using a service key, he opened the controller cabinet and manually overrode the elevator's door interlock circuit before moving the elevator car several floors above the lobby. He then closed the cabinet and left the building at the end of his shift. Pressing the call button at the lobby level would now cause the doors to slide open, even though the elevator car was not present. Nothing about them would look wrong to someone waiting in the corridor. Diane arrived the following morning at 6:52 a.m. The lobby was quiet. She pressed the elevator call button as she did every morning. The doors slid open. She stepped forward and fell into the shaft. A security guard reviewing the footage noticed the abnormal door event and went to check the lobby, where he found the elevator doors open with the shaft exposed. He contacted emergency services immediately. Fire department rescue personnel and paramedics responded to the scene and recovered Diane Mercer from the base of the shaft. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators secured the elevator controller cabinet and reviewed the building's access logs, which confirmed Pruitt had been the only certified technician to open the cabinet the previous evening. A forensic elevator inspector examined the safety interlock system and confirmed that multiple independent safety mechanisms had been deliberately bypassed, a finding inconsistent with any known mechanical failure or routine maintenance procedure. Gary Pruitt was arrested 3 days later and charged with murder under Ohio law. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in state prison.